Most people think debt is debt. They throw every balance into one ugly mental pile, stare at the total, feel disgusted, and then make the same mistake millions of households make for decades. They attack whatever debt feels morally offensive instead of understanding what the debt is actually doing to their future. I have watched people work very hard and still weaken their financial life because they never learned one simple distinction. Some debt is expensive poison, some debt is manageable, and some debt used correctly is one of the most useful tools in wealth building. That is not a fashionable thing to say. The public likes simple moral stories about money. Debt bad, savings good, house noble, cash safe, investing dangerous. Those little slogans sound responsible, but they do not describe reality very well. Reality is much more mathematical than moral. A 5% debt is not the same thing as a 25% debt. A debt attached to an appreciating asset is not the same thing as a debt attached to mindless consumption. A fixed low rate held for decades is not the same thing as revolving consumer debt that compounds against you every month like a quiet infection. Once you understand that, the whole subject changes. You stop asking, how do I become debt-free as fast as possible? You start asking, which dollars should go toward eliminating risk, and which dollars should be sent into assets that will make my future larger? That is a better question. I have spent most of my life around capital, businesses, cash flow, interest rates, and human behavior. And one thing that becomes obvious after enough years is that households usually do not get into trouble. They get into trouble because they misallocate effort. They are sincere. They are disciplined. They make the payments. They avoid obvious recklessness. And still they arrive at 50 or 60 and wonder why the numbers feel smaller than they should. Often the answer is simple. They spent 20 years using good money to attack the wrong problem. They killed cheap debt and protected expensive habits. They reduced low-cost liabilities while neglecting wealth, producing assets. They congratulated themselves for paying things off while the clock of compounding kept moving without them. That is how a person can feel responsible and still end up financially weaker than someone who looked less pure but understood the arithmetic better. The world teaches people to feel noble about debt elimination. I care much more about whether the elimination is intelligent. If a debt is expensive enough, unstable enough, and destructive enough, then yes, attack it with extreme force. If a debt is cheap, fixed, and attached to a useful asset, then prepaying it aggressively can be one of the costliest mistakes in a lifetime. That sounds backwards until you understand what money is supposed to do. Money is not just there to reduce a balance. Money is there to produce a future. That difference changes everything. Suppose a man in his 40s has a stable income, a mortgage at 3.5%, a car loan below 4%, federal student loans at 5 or 6%, no emergency reserve to speak of, almost nothing invested outside a small retirement account, and a habit of sending every extra dollar toward whatever debt makes him feel emotionally uncomfortable that month. He thinks he is being serious. He thinks he is cleaning up his life. He is often doing the opposite. Because if that same dollar could earn 8, 9, 10 or more over long stretches in productive assets, then using it to eliminate a 3.5% obligation is not prudence. It is a low-return use of scarce capital, and scarce capital must be respected. This is one reason I have always admired capital allocation so much. The same dollar can create very different futures depending on where it goes. If you send it into a business earning superior returns on capital, it becomes larger. If you send it into an emergency reserve when your life is too fragile to function without one, it becomes stability. If you send it into high-interest consumer debt, it becomes a rescue mission. If you send it into the early prepayment of very cheap debt, it often becomes a weaker future disguised as discipline. That is what most people do not see. They see the psychological pleasure of reducing a balance. They do not see the wealth they failed to build, because the capital never got the chance to compound somewhere better. There are 3 broad categories of debt ordinary people must learn to separate. The first is toxic debt. The second is tolerable debt. The third is strategic debt. Toxic debt is the debt that actively attacks your future every month. Credit cards at 20, 25, or 30%, personal loans with ugly rates. Payday structures, buy, now pay, ladder balances that disguise their true cost. Anything where the interest is so high that almost no sensible investment can reasonably compete with the guaranteed return of eliminating it. That kind of debt is not a debate. You kill it fast, no romance, no excuses. No elaborate investment theory used as a shield. You kill it because it is eating the future faster than you can build it. Tolerable debt is different. It is not great, but it is not the emergency people treat it as. A federal student loan at a moderate fixed rate can live here. A car loan at a low rate can live here if the car itself was chosen intelligently. A mortgage at a historically low fixed rate almost certainly lives here. These obligations may not be exciting, but they are not financial emergencies either. And that distinction matters because capital sent toward a non-emergency carries an opportunity cost. Strategic debt is the category the public understands least. This is debt that is so cheap, so stable, or so productively attached that keeping it while you invest elsewhere can make your long-term financial life much stronger. That does not mean borrowing recklessly. That does not mean taking every loan available just because leverage sounds sophisticated. It means recognizing that if you can borrow at 3 or 4% and sensibly earn much more over long stretches in productive assets, then the debt is not your primary enemy. Misallocated cash flow is. That is the whole issue. Now let us begin with the one that causes the most emotional confusion. The low-interest mortgage. Americans are taught from early adulthood that paying off the house early is one of the highest forms of virtue. It sounds prudent. It sounds responsible. It sounds like something a calm, wise family does, while less disciplined people are busy making mistakes elsewhere. Sometimes it is wise. Very often it is not. If you locked in a mortgage between roughly 2.5% and 4.5% during the long, easy money stretch, you hold one of the cheapest forms of long-term capital many households will ever see in their lives. That matters. It matters because the market does not offer that kind of cheap fixed money very often. It matters because inflation itself may erode the real cost of that debt over time. And it matters because every extra dollar you send toward principal is a dollar not being used for higher return purposes. I want you to see the arithmetic plainly. If you have a 3.5% mortgage and you send an extra $500 a month to principal, the return on that extra payment is effectively 3.5%. That is what you are earning by avoiding future interest. Fine. Now compare that with sending the same $500 into broad productive ownership over a long enough period. The historical long-run return of the American stock market is materially higher than that mortgage rate. The exact path will wobble. It will frighten you at times. Some decades will be better, some worse. But over long stretches, productive ownership has done far more than 3.5%. The gap between those two outcomes over 20 years is not small. It can be enormous. That is what makes the prepayment mistake so costly. It does not merely reduce your flexibility in the present. It starves the compounding engine in the exact years when the compounding engine could be doing the heaviest lifting. Now, I understand the emotional argument. People do not like owing money on their shelter. They want the psychological relief of saying the house is paid off. I understand that, but I want adults to distinguish between emotional relief and superior financial outcomes. Those are not always the same. A paid-off house with too little invested capital beside. It can leave a household feeling proud and still structurally weak. A household with a modest mortgage at a very low rate, alongside large investment accounts and meaningful liquidity, may carry debt on paper and still be vastly stronger in real life. Strength matters more than purity. The paid-off house also creates another illusion. People think that because the mortgage is gone, the burden is gone. No property taxes remain. Insurance remains, maintenance remains, repairs remain, utility costs remain. A house is never a free asset simply because the bank's claim disappeared. If a family empties its investing power just to erase the mortgage while leaving the rest of the structure undercapitalized, it may end up with a beautiful house and a much weaker future. That is not intelligent. If your mortgage rate is high, this discussion changes. If your rate is 6.5, 7, or more, prepaying may become much more attractive. That is the adult part of debt strategy. It is not religion, it is arithmetic. But for the huge number of people still holding low fixed mortgage debt, I would much rather see extra principal payments redirected first toward emergency reserves, then toward retirement accounts, then toward taxable investing, and only later, perhaps much later, toward optional prepayment. If the rest of the financial structure is already strong, the cheap mortgage is not your main problem. The absence of productive assets is. Now let us move to federal student loans, because this is where a great many people commit slow-motion financial self-harm in the name of responsibility. I have watched young professionals spend their entire 20s and half their 30s attacking federal student loans with such intensity that they arrive at 40 with almost no retirement capital. They feel proud because the debt is gone. Then they finally look at the retirement math and realize they sacrificed the most valuable compounding years of their lives to eliminate a moderate rate obligation while neglecting the one engine that could have transformed their future. That is a bitter discovery. The trouble is not merely the interest rate. The trouble is time. $1 invested at 25 is not the same thing as $1 invested at 45. The second dollar may still help, but it does not get the same runway. It does not get the same decades of reinvestment recovery, dividend growth, and market expansion. That is why I become concerned when I see a young worker making double and triple payments on a federal loan at 5 or 6% while failing to capture an employer retirement match or failing to fund a Roth IRA. That is backwards. An employer match is not just a nice benefit. It is an immediate return far above the interest cost of that federal debt. Walking away from that to pay the loan faster is not discipline. It is misallocation. Likewise, federal student loans often come with flexibility that other forms of debt do not. There may be income-driven arrangements. There may be hardship options. There may be forgiveness paths depending on occupation and program structure. I am not telling anyone to build his life around political promises. I am saying the debt has features that make it less urgent than high-rate consumer poison and less structurally dangerous than people often imagine. That matters. I would rather see a young professional do this. Make the required payment, never damage the credit. Capture the employer match in full. Build a real emergency reserve. Fund a Roth IRA if eligible. Then continue building productive assets systematically while evaluating the student loan rationally instead of morally. This is what billionaires and serious allocators do better than the public. They do not ask which decision sounds more virtuous. They ask where each dollar can produce the highest long-term return, adjusted for risk and flexibility. If the student loan rate is moderate and the investment runway is long, then the dollar often belongs in the asset, not in the aggressive prepayment. Now, if the loan is private, expensive, and rigid, that is another story. I am talking specifically about federal student debt with manageable fixed terms. Again, nuance matters. A lot of public financial advice is just laziness dressed as simplicity. Debt bad, pay it all fast. Never borrow. That sort of thinking feels clean and usually produces mediocre outcomes. The world is not clean. The world is messy, which means your thinking must be precise. The third category is low-interest auto debt. This is the one many people resist emotionally because cars create identity in a way numbers cannot. Now let me say something clearly before someone twists my point. I am not in favor of buying a foolish car simply because the financing looked attractive. That is idiotic. A low rate does not transform a bad purchase into a good one. What I am saying is that if the car itself was chosen sensibly and the financing rate is very low, Rushing to eliminate that debt can be another example of capital misallocation. A car is a depreciating asset. That is true, which is exactly why I would rather hold on to cheap financing and let more of my capital remain available for compounding elsewhere than dump extra cash into early payoff, just to experience the psychological thrill of owning the declining asset outright. Suppose you financed at 3% or 4%. Suppose the payment fits comfortably inside a budget that is already under control. Why would you accelerate repayment if your alternative is investing into higher return assets or strengthening liquidity? Again, this is where people become moral instead of mathematical. They say, "I hate payments." Fine. A feeling is not a return. The question is what the money does. If an extra $200 or $300 per month sent to principal gives you a 3 or 4% equivalent return, but the same money deployed into productive assets over many years gives you much more, then the prepayment is not helping you become richer. It is helping you feel cleaner, and cleaner is not the same as stronger. I prefer stronger. There is another hidden issue here. Liquidity. People underestimate the value of keeping cash and investment capacity available instead of burying it into cheap debt reduction. If you pay extra against the mortgage, extra against the student loan, extra against the car, and then something goes wrong, you may discover that what you called financial discipline was actually a series of irreversible transfers into low-return debt reduction while your liquid position remained weak. That is not prudent. That is brittle. A brittle household is one emergency away from stupidity. A liquid household has options. Options matter enormously. If you lose a job, if a business opportunity appears, if a family emergency arrives, if the market corrects violently and genuine bargains appear, the family with liquidity has choices. The family that buried every spare dollar into cheap debt may have less nominal debt, yes, but far less room to think. That is why I always tell people that cheap debt and weak liquidity can be a much worse combination than cheap debt and strong reserves. The reserve is not there to flatter your account balance. It is there to keep you from making desperate decisions. Now let me give you the hierarchy I would use, because this is where most households need clarity. First, if high-interest consumer debt exists, destroy it. Not eventually, not after a philosophy seminar. Destroy it. Credit card debt at 22% or 29% is financial poison. There is almost no sane investment case for carrying that, while talking about broad market returns and strategic leverage. That is not strategy. That is avoidance. The guaranteed return on eliminating that debt is so high that it deserves maximum urgency. This is the scorched earth category. Cut spending, sell what should be sold. Take the extra work if necessary. Do not let the poison stay in the body because you were trying to sound advanced. Second, capture all employer retirement match. Every dollar. There are very few risk-free immediate returns in life. This is one of them. If an employer is matching your contribution, that is part of your compensation. Refusing it while you prepay moderate debt is like turning down salary, because debt freedom sounds more moral. That is not intelligence. Third, build the emergency reserve. 3 to 6 months of true living expenses is a good rule for many households. More if the income is unstable or the household structure is fragile. I want people to understand something here. The emergency fund is not lazy cash. It is defense against panic. It is protection against forced credit card use. It is the thing that keeps an ordinary setback from becoming a financial infection. Fourth, fund tax, advantage growth, retirement accounts, Roth structures where eligible long-run compounding vehicles, productive ownership. This is where the future begins getting built, and only after the toxic debt is gone, the match is captured, the reserve exists, and the long-run investing structure is being fed consistently. Do I think people should obsess over attacking moderate, low-cost debt? That is a very different order from the one most households use. That is why most households stay busy and still do not become wealthy. They are fighting the wrong battle first. Now, let me talk about what should happen to the money you free up once you stop overpaying the wrong debts. It must go into assets, not drift, not get absorbed quietly by lifestyle inflation, not disappear into nicer versions of the same consumption habits, assets. This is where the real shift happens. A family stops sending extra money to a 3.5% mortgage, a 5% federal student loan, and a low-rate auto note. Fine, wonderful. But if the money simply leaks into more dining out, bigger vacations, and subscriptions nobody uses, then the strategy solved nothing. The whole point is redeployment. Capital must be redirected, not merely released. That means broad market funds, retirement accounts, dividend, paying businesses, quality assets, taxable brokerage accounts after the foundations are built. It means the cash that was once disappearing into low-return debt elimination is now being turned into ownership. Ownership is what changes the life, not the payment history by itself. I like dividend. Paying assets for one practical reason many people underestimate. Cash flow changes behavior. A person receiving income from assets tends to think differently from a person relying entirely on earned income. The first person begins feeling what capital can do. The second person still experiences money primarily as labor translated into bills. I want people to graduate from that second world into the first one. Not because labor is bad, because capital should eventually begin helping labor. That is what real financial progress looks like. This is one reason I like high-quality dividend funds and great dividend-paying businesses for many families. Not because dividends are magical, because they are tangible, they show up. They can be reinvested. They teach people the difference between owning something and merely hoping the price goes up someday. Now, let me say something blunt. Being debt-free is not the same thing as being wealthy. That confusion has cost people enormous amounts of money. I know people with no debt and almost no assets. I know people carrying low-cost strategic debt against productive assets, while their net worth, cash flow, and resilience are vastly stronger. Which one is richer? The public likes the clean story. Debt-free equals success. No, wealth is what remains after the liabilities are considered. Yes, but it is also what the structure can do for your life. A person with no debt and no assets is not strong. A person with cheap fixed debt, large investment accounts, real reserves, and growing passive cash flow may be vastly stronger. The world confuses simplicity of label with superiority of structure. I do not. Structure is what matters. Always. Now, because I know human beings are emotional creatures, let me address the objection that always comes. But I sleep better knowing I owe less. Fine, then pay less debt. If that is the premium you knowingly choose to pay for your emotional comfort. There is nothing wrong with buying peace. What is wrong is pretending the lower return decision is the higher return decision. Call it what it is. An emotional allocation preference, not a superior mathematical outcome. There is no shame in that. If you understand the trade, there is great danger in lying to yourself about it. That is the key. I respect peace. I also respect truth. If you choose to prepay a cheap mortgage because the emotional value to you is enormous, fine. But understand you are likely giving up some expected future wealth to buy that emotional relief. That may still be a good trade for you. At least make it consciously. Conscious trade-offs are intelligent. Unconscious ones are how people drift into regret. I have always believed money should serve the life, not the other way around. That means there are moments when a slightly inferior mathematical choice can still be the correct choice, if it materially improves the quality of the life. But if you do not know the mathematics first, then you are not choosing, you are wandering. I dislike wandering with money. Money deserves direction. So here is the whole principle as plainly as I can state it. Stop treating all debt as one thing. Cheap debt is not expensive debt. Fixed debt is not floating poison. Productive leverage is not consumer destruction. A low-rate mortgage is not a credit card balance. A federal student loan is not a payday loan. A modest auto note on a sensible car is not a luxury lease on a symbol of insecurity. These are different animals. And serious adults should make decisions accordingly. If the debt is toxic, kill it. If the debt is cheap and the structure around it is healthy, stop obsessively prepaying it and start building assets. That is how you turn your financial life from a permanent cleanup project into a compounding machine. And a compounding machine, once properly fed, can do more for your future than almost any debt elimination strategy the public praises out of habit. That is what I want for people. Not cleaner labels, stronger futures. That has always seemed to me the better bargain.